Right, so this time we're going to have a look at camera matching in Maya. So the idea is that we've filmed a live action backplate and we're going to try and set up a camera in Maya to match that. So this was with a static camera, not a moving camera. So if I have a look here at what I've got to start with, just a few bits and pieces. So if I have a look at my live action shot, I've already shot that. It was obviously in some kind of video codec from the camera, exported it as a DPX sequence in fact, and then undistorted that footage, so we're kind of dealing with, you know, just kind of completely straight lines or straight lines, etc., undistorted versions. So here's just a single plate static camera, so there's not much going on here really. You know, if you scrub through it, you maybe see a few leaves blowing around or something like that. Basically a static camera. So what I want to try and do is in Maya recreate a camera in Maya that is in the same position, kind of relative to everything in my scene as the real camera was. So that what I'm going to do is kind of animate some kind of, you know, model, you know, car, whatever, kind of moving around this scene in Maya, render it out and composite it later as a kind of VFX shot. So we've got this undistorted image sequence, and at the time I shot it, I actually measured the set fairly carefully. So I created a kind of measurement here for a baseline from my camera. So I kind of measured the distance really in this kind of gap here, and then I measured the camera position, kind of triangulated from there. You know. So I've got a really neat data sheet here. You know, it's a work of art. And here it is, beautiful. There we are. Right. So there's that kind of 149 centimeter baseline, and then I measured the distance from one end here to, this is the camera by the way, in case you can't realize. This is my camera position, and I measured from the other end of that baseline similarly back to my camera position. So that was 245 centimeters there, and I can read it. That's 332 centimeters right along there. I also measured quite a lot of other information about that set. So I measured the camera height at 63 centimeters. I used a little inclinometer to kind of measure the tilt of the camera down, so 3.8 degrees pointing down towards the ground, and it also had a little bit of Dutch roll, again measured with an inclinometer of about 0.9 degrees. Not sure how accurate that was really, whether it was calibrated, but hey ho, we've got that measurement. Also measured some bunch of other things, like how high those kind of little bits of the set were, the kind of width of the path and so on, things like that. So I got all those kind of measurements, and I also measured the kind of width of one of the paving slabs just in case I needed that to kind of help match the camera as well. Right, so let's go into Maya and let's actually start trying to match this then. So here we are in Maya. We've got a typical scene here. Now obviously there's a few things we're going to need to do. One of which is we're going to need to work in real world scale inside of Maya, because obviously all my measurements were real world scale, and this scene in Maya, this grid, is probably not really sized right for real world. So first of all, this is just a new Maya pretty much default project here, so there's nothing really happened yet. So if I just go to my settings and preferences, I'm just going to have a look at the standard preferences here, and I'm just going to check standard settings here, and you can see here that my working units linear is centimeter. That's pretty much Maya's default, but if I'd set that to something else, I might want to set it back to centimeter, or if I wanted to work in meters, I would have to adjust everything appropriately. Yep. So I'm going to stick with centimeters. I kind of find that works reasonably well, so I'm just going to sort of save those. So this grid here, at least I know Maya's units. If there's 5 units in Maya, that means 5 centimeters. So I'm going to set up my display, and I'm going to set up my grid to be a sensible size based on what's happening here. So my grid is just kind of over here. So at the moment, Maya's set up for the length and width of this scene to be 12 units. Now we know that's 12 centimeters now, so that's basically meaning from my origin here all the way over to here, that is 12 centimeters. grid lines every 5 units with 5 subdivisions, so basically every 1 unit essentially. So basically each of these little squares here is 1 by 1 centimetre. Now my scene, I know, was kind of in, you know, 2.5, 3 and a bit meters, 1.5 meters. So these are all hundreds of centimeters. My whole Maya scene is only 24 centimeters each way. So that's kind of not really making sense. So I'm going to set this up to be instead 500 units, and I'm going to have grid lines every 100 units and just one subdivision. Right? So basically and I'm just going to then apply that. Obviously everything is going to get rescaled a little bit here, and if I just move the perspective camera there a little bit, view, so we can see now this is basically from this origin here, this is now 500 units back to here, so that's 5 meters, 500 centimeters, and I've set this to be every 100 with just one subdivision, so each square is a meter in size. Yeah, you could pick different units, but just pick something sensible for your scene. That kind of works reasonably for my scene. Okay, so I'm kind of happy with that. A good opportunity maybe to save my scene. Now I'm kind of working with one of these kind of pipeline sets of folders here, so I'm just going to save this in scene 1, shot 1, 3D. I'm going to save this in animation, and I'm going to call this lab 3010 because it's scene 1, 0010 because it's shot 1. It's going to be an animation, and it's going to be me that's doing this, SMC, and I'm going to call this 2 in this case because I've actually got some other files in there, but I'd probably call it version 1 otherwise, so at least I've got this saved. Right. So I'm then going to need obviously a camera. It goes without saying really. So let's just go into here, let's create a standard camera. Okay, just with the default settings. Now one of the things you'll see is that my camera locator is absolutely minuscule because it's there, but if I zoom in a bit we can see there it is. It's kind of very, very tiny though, so I'm probably going to want to make that a little bit bigger. So I'm going to want to kind of go down here, and where is this? This one under object display, there we go, and we have our locator scale for our camera. So let's maybe make that a little bit bigger. 30, maybe a touch too big for me, maybe 20. Yeah, that's good. Right, so that's fine. So that doesn't change anything about the camera except the size of that display of the camera icon really. So one of the first things I want to match is the focal length. Now that can be a little bit fiddly because real world focal length, or sort of equivalent focal length, is partly to do with the kind of focal length of the lens that you've selected, but there's also a relationship between that and what Maya calls this camera aperture here. You know, a lot of people would also refer to that as the size of the sensor in the camera, but in Maya, camera aperture is what that's referred to. So that's the physical size of the sensor in the camera, or at least the imageable area of that sensor. Now you're going to need to go find that out for whatever camera you're dealing with. So if you're dealing with an unusual camera, this website is pretty good, vfxcamdb.com. We actually shot this on a Sony FS7, nice camera. As you can see down here, it gives me some sensor dimensions. Right? Now with some cameras you're going to have to be a little bit wary of, is that whole sensor actually being used when I'm shooting? Because depending on the resolution you're choosing to use with your camera, chances are if you're shooting full resolution with the camera, it's using that whole thing. If you're shooting at a lower resolution, you may find it's not actually using that whole sensor. So you may have to do a little bit of testing with that, maybe a little bit more Googling if you're lucky. I've actually kind of got some of my notes here earlier. So with the FS7, you can see here, really with the full 4K DCP resolution, it's shooting full sensor width and height. But with UHD 3840 by 2160 or HD 1920 by 1080, it's actually kind of slightly lower. Yep. What it's doing with HD is it's obviously using this larger area and then internally in the camera it's actually kind of resizing. Yeah, I did wonder whether these would actually be different, but filming with those, you can see you actually get an identical aspect ratio, an identical image. But when you film with 4K DCP, you're actually getting a little bit wider image, and it's actually using the full area. So just be aware of that, and you will need to find that out for whatever camera you were using. So the footage I shot here is actually HD 1080. So I know that from my kind of little notes there that sensor camera aperture should be 22.125 millimeters by 13.3 millimeters. Yep. So that is my correct camera aperture. Right. Now, if I don't enter that correctly, the focal length I put in here, kind of in a way, is a bit meaningless if I'm trying to match a real camera. So I need to kind of know that camera aperture. Right. The focal length, again, for our cameras is a little bit tricky, because most of the time, of course, what you're going to do is you're just going to kind of get a camera lens, and this one's a prime lens. It's in fact the lens I shot with, a Canon 50mm lens. So with a prime, it's just going to have a fixed focal. You might use a zoom lens that may well have a range of focal lengths, obviously. So you'd need to know that. On my data sheet, I did actually note down on the other size the focal I was using, which was a 50mm. Right? So, okay, so that's fine. Unfortunately, on my camera, we actually use a kind of adapter. So we've actually got one of these little lens metabones adapters. So the FS7s, Sony FS7s, don't take Canon lenses right out the bat. You have to have some kind of adapter between the lens and the camera for it all to work. Unfortunately, those adapters, as you can see here, the kind of net effect is that they change the focal length. They actually make the focal length slightly wider, the equivalent. So what I would do is I would take my focal length and multiply it by that number to end up with the effective focal length, which you can see in my particular example here. If I was using a 50mm lens, which I was, with that adapter, it's effectively a 35.5mm lens. Yep. So in here I would pop in that, which as you can see is very little different in fact from Meyer's default here of 35.35 itself, so 35.5. Okay, so I've set my focal length for my camera and I've got my camera aperture, and there is this relationship between those because, you know, this is kind of typical kind of crop factor type thing. Yeah, so if I was using a particular sensor size, let's say a full frame 35mm sensor there, yep, and I used a particular length lens, let's say for example this was all shot with a 50mm lens, this kind of larger area here is what I would see with that lens on a full frame sensor. But as I lower the sensor size in the camera, I'm actually seeing a cropped version of that image. Yeah. So if I had a 2/3 inch sensor, I'm only getting that bit inside that little orange square there. If I have a 1/3 inch, only inside that little red area there. So that's why we need to know the lens focal, but we also need to know the size of the camera aperture or the sensor size. So that's very important. So there we go. So they're both input. Great. So I've got my camera. Now I'm just going to move my camera a little bit. So I'm going to just kind of go into Meyer's usual kind of move tools and just move it back a little bit. Yep. Nothing special. Okay. So I'm then also going to want to start reconstructing my scene. Now I'm going to do this by reconstructing this triangle here, really. Yep. So that's what I'm going to do in a minute. But I also know my camera height is 63 centimeters and I have this tilt down. So I can actually go into my camera and let's go to the channel box here, and I can take my translate Y, so that's my height, and put in my 63 centimeters. Yep. And for the moment I'm then going to just kind of select this translate Y, right click this here on the Mac, and I'm just going to lock that temporarily because I don't really want to change that camera height now. I may later want to tweak it, but for the moment I know that's the camera height I measured. I'm going to leave that there. Okay, so I also have a tilt of 3.8 degrees down, so that's a rotate around my x-axis, and obviously down would be minus, so I could put in a minus 3.8 degree x rotation. So there we go, just a small rotation, and again, because I don't really want to nudge that, I'm just going to lock that for the minute. Yep. Oh, I don't think it's quite locked that yet. There we go, lock that selected. Okay, so we've got our camera height and we've got some of our initial rotation. I did have a Dutch roll of 0.9 degrees, but I'm not going to put that in yet because it's so slight. I'm just going to take a look, see how it comes out. I may find that measurement was so slight it's not going to make a difference. Right, so what I'm going to do first then is I'm going to kind of draw out some measure tools in Maya to kind of mirror these kind of sides of this triangle. Yep. Where I position them doesn't really matter. I'm going to put my baseline starting at my origin in Maya, and it's 149 centimeters long. So I'm just going to go up here. I could even go into my top view, I suppose. That wouldn't be a bad idea. Yep. So I'm going to my top view again. Just kind of move this kind of here. Yep. There's lovely. That's about right. And I'm going to create a measure tool. So there we are. I'm going to create a distance tool. And I know it's 149 centimeters, so I'm going to sort of click here and click about 1.5 meters along there, like that. 153, okay, pretty close, right? Not close enough, but pretty close, right? So what I will get then in my outliner is I'll actually get three things when I create a measure tool: a distance dimension and two locators. And the locators are either end of that measure tool. Now again, they look a little small in my Maya viewport here, so I'm maybe just going to select both of those and put in a different scale value for those. Yeah, maybe 30. Yep. Maybe 30 is a bit high. Maybe 20. So let's kind of just select those again and put in 20. Okay, great. Let's just do that one at a time then. Okay. Great. So we've got our locators resized a little bit. This distance dimension is actually showing the wrong dimension. Now, I can't move it very directly, so what I will do is move the locators. So I want this one to be exactly on my Maya origin. Right? Just arbitrary, but you know, you've got to pick somewhere to put it, and I'm going to go for my Maya origin. Keeps my other points relatively easy. This other locator, the other end of my baseline, I know was 149 centimeters, and I'm going to choose that to be in my x-axis here. So at the moment, my translate x is 154. I'm going to set that to 149. So that's the same distance I measured my baseline, and I want there to be this to be on my ground plane. So all my other measurements are 0. Yep. And I'll just check that for the other one. Yep. 0, 0, 0, and 149, 0, and 0. So this is now showing me 149 centimeters. Now I'm then going to rename some of these in my outliner because I'm going to have a few measure tools and I want these to be sensibly named. So I'm going to go for that for baseline, and I'm going to call this something imaginative like baseline underscore left. Yeah. And something super imaginative like baseline underscore right. That'll do me nicely. Okay, so that's fine. I'm then going to make the other sides of this triangle. So my data sheet here, where's my data sheet gone? Have I just disappeared my data sheet? Yep, I've kind of managed to hide that somewhere. Okay, so I know my other measurements were 245 and 332 centimeters. So again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move my camera out of the way a little bit, and I'm going to select my locator, and I'm just going to create another measure tool going vertically down here, and another one going vertically down here that just mimic the distances of those kind of measurements. So if I just kind of find that data sheet again here, we can see that. So if I go into my data sheets here, there's my data plan here, so 245 and 332. So I'm just going to recreate another couple of measure tools with those measurements. So let's go here, and let's just increment and save this just in case. So I'm going to go into here and I'm going to go to create, and I'm going to go to measure tools and create another distance tool. So I'm going to create this from my origin down about 245. There we go. 231, pretty close again. So before I do anything else, then I'm going to then rename this. Now it's pretty common to define the point where the camera was as the station point, and that's often abbreviated with the letter X. So I'm just going to call this LX as a distance measure, because it's from the left end of my baseline to X, the station point of the camera, where the camera was. You could use another descriptive name. So I'm going to call this locator, because it's at the top of that, I'm going to call this LX underscore top. And the other one obviously is going to be right at the bottom here. That's going to be LX underscore bottom. Yeah. Again, with these locators, they come out a little small by default, so I'm just going to set that to be 20. Yep. So I've got something a bit bigger. Right, I'm going to move these locators to the right position. So the top one I want to be exactly on the origin. Yeah. So that's sitting at one end of the baseline. Yeah. The bottom one I want to be exactly 245 units along, in this case that would be the z-axis in Maya, so I'm going to set that to be 0 in x, 0 in y, and exactly 245 in z. So there we go, so that's now in the right position. So that distance is correct. My camera was that far away from the baseline. The direction is wrong, but the distance is right. Okay, so I can then happily go and create my final measure tool. So I'm going to create another distance tool here, measure tool, distance tool, and this time I want it to be from this right hand edge here, and this one's going to be about 3 meters long, 3 and a bit, isn't it? So it doesn't really matter too much to get it right here, but there we go. So, oh gosh, almost spot on. So this one, not surprisingly, I'm going to call it RX, because this one is coming from the right hand edge of my baseline to X, the station point. Again, you may choose a different name. So my locator here, I'm going to call this rather similarly RX top, same as I did with the other one, and I'm going to call this RX bottom. Fine. Again, I just need to nudge these locators into the right position and probably select the two and scale them up. Okay, 20 units seemed about right. Yep, just makes them a bit more visible in the viewport. Right, so I need to position them. So the right top locator, obviously it should be 0 in z, because my z-axis is going up and down here, and it should be at one end of the baseline. Now if my baseline started at 0, 0, 0, obviously the right edge is 149 units along in x, because that's how long my baseline is. So I want the top edge here to be 149 along in x. That's pretty close, 150 odd there, so 149. Yep, great stuff. And then the bottom one, because I'm just drawing a vertical line here now, I'm going to want that to be 149 as well. Nothing in y, and then z, I want that to be 332, because that's the measurement I had. Perfect. So I'm happy with that. So I could, even with those top locators, only the top ones, actually lock their translates, because I don't want the top ones now to move. The bottom ones I do want to move because they're not in the right place, but the top ones I want them to lock at either end of the baseline. And indeed I could do the same with both of the baseline locators, because again I don't want the baseline locators to move anymore. They're in exactly the right position as far as I'm concerned. Yep. Okay, nice. So now what I'm going to do is try and position my camera correctly. So I've got this baseline, I've got these locators, they're all measured, they're the right distances, they agree with my plan. I've got my focal, my camera height all set up. So these locators at the bottom here, they basically must have been in the same place, because there's a triangle. Here's my baseline. My camera was actually kind of over roughly where it is now, in fact, sort of very roughly. But there was a triangle where the station point, obviously both of these went to the station point, i.e. where the camera was. So what I'm going to do is actually sort of move or rotate these points around the baseline, keeping the distance the same, around in a sort of imaginary circle around these locators. And there will be one point where the two of these actually are in the same position. They kind of overlap, and that must be where my camera was. So I'm just going to set up a really simple rig to help me do that, which is very straightforward. So if I just take the top locator here, and there's the bottom locator for the left. So if I go to select the bottom one first, and then command click or control click probably on the PC to select the top locator, I can do this with a keyboard shortcut, but basically I want to go to edit and parent one to the other. Yep. Just hit P on the keyboard, does the same thing. Yep. So what I will have in my outliner now is I will have my top locator, and there will be a child which will be the bottom locator. So always when you're parenting these, select the child first, then select the parent, then hit P or go to edit parent to create that. So if I now select my top locator here, and I just go into Maya's rotate tools, if I rotate that, you can see it's going to rotate that locator, but because it's parented, it will actually move, not rotate, it will move the bottom locator, keeping the distance the same around that point, which is exactly what I want to be doing. I'm just going to leave that there for the minute. Okay, so I want to do the same with the right one, so I'm going to select the bottom, that's the child, then command or control and select the top one, and just press P this time on the keyboard and get my parented very simple rig. So I can now select these top locators and rotate them around. Now basically I know my camera was sort of over roughly there in the world. You know, if I look at my data sheet again, I can see there's my baseline. My camera was kind of over on the left and down a bit from the original space. I know roughly it was kind of around there. So if I go back into Maya, I can say, right, my camera was kind of over here somewhere then, very roughly. So if I start rotating these points around, what I'm trying to do is get to a point where did these things actually overlap, and that should be where my camera should be. Yeah. So I kind of zoom in here a little bit and just middle mouse over there. Yeah, you can see I'm kind of getting pretty close, not probably close enough, but kind of pretty close here. And this probably is going to be something that you kind of tweak around a bit, tweak around a little bit, just so we can get it right. And that's kind of looking roughly right. Yeah, something like that. Now this isn't precisely right, but to be honest, I'm going to have to tweak this a little bit in a minute anyway. So, nearly finished here for part one. I'm going to do another part of this in a minute. So I'm just going to take my camera and move my camera into that position. I would have matched my camera then, but I will be part way through that process. So, if I actually look at one of these measure tools now, not the locators, the measure tools, and I go into the attribute editor, you can see that end point there. That's actually the XYZ position of the end point of the measure tool, and that is where I want to move my camera to. So as you can see, 0 and Y. Of course I've already set a Y height for my camera, so I won't change that. It's really the X and Z positions I really want. So in this case, minus 89.776 and 227.959. Now I can see that my dimension tools probably don't exactly overlap. If I look at, this is the LX, if I look at RX, those numbers are very slightly different, because I haven't quite got them into the same position. Now I could probably tweak this and get them a little bit closer, or I could be very crude and pick an average of the two or whatever it is, but I'm going to go with, let's say, these numbers here. So minus 91.112. So minus 91.112 is my X position. So I'm going to select my camera now. There's my camera, go to the channel box and just enter in that value, minus 91.112 I think. Yep. And there we go. It's moved the X position of the camera more or less into place. And then if I go to my distance measure tool again, the LX, go back to the attribute editor. So I must have used the RX one. Yeah, I was using the RX. And then the Z is 229.282. So 229.282. Okay, see if I can remember that. 229.282. So I go to my camera, and I then go to the channel box, and I go to 229.282. I think that was right for my translate Z. Right. So that's looking fairly decent. I'm kind of at least getting there. I've got my camera in the right XYZ position, and I've rotated it down. The big thing I don't have right yet is I definitely don't have the kind of rotation angle. So I know my camera in fact must be pointing not this way but more this way. Now I'm going to look at kind of tweaking that a little bit in part 2, but just lastly here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look through this camera. So this is my camera I'm trying to match. I'm going to import the actual footage that I used. So I'm just going to go into the camera. So I'm looking through my camera here. In fact, I ought to name my camera. Camera 1 is a bit rubbish. So I'm just going to name my camera. I'm going to label this Lab 3, that's my project name, Scene 1010, Shot 10010, and I'm going to call that Render Cam or something like that. Yep, so at least it's got a vaguely sensible name. I'm then going to go to View, so I'm looking through that camera, and I'm going to go to Image Plane, and I'm going to import an image. Now what I'm going to do here is import the undistorted image. So I've already undistorted it, so I'm just going to go onto my desktop, select my undistorted image, so that's in Scene 1, Shot 1 in live action here, and it's the undistorted images. Now I'm just going to select any one of those, it doesn't really matter. Maya's just going to bring in that image. Yay, there we go. So this is my baseline, so I'm kind of getting there. So, and I can see it's my undistorted images because I've got these little kind of black areas where it's undistorted the frame. Now I also want to use an image sequence because I actually shot a series of frames here. So if I look at the attribute editor for my camera here, here's my image plane shape. Now if I go to my image sequence here, there we are, so there's the image name, and I just want to check use image sequence, and happily Maya makes my image go away. So there's a reason for that, and that's basically if I'm using an image sequence rather than just one frame, I need my frame numbers down here to match the frame numbers I have for my shot. So if I actually look at my shot, there we go, my understore here, my first frame number is frame 1001, and if I scroll down a little bit here, my last frame number is frame 1075. So I'm just going to set those here. So frame 1001 and frame 1075. There we go, looking good. Still doesn't update, but if I now click anywhere here, perfect, and I can scrub through here. Because it's a static camera with very little in the scene, not much is happening, we can just about see a leaf blowing around here, I think, something pretty undramatic. So there we go, so we've got our image plane in here. If I go back to my perspective view, we can see this image plane has come in front of our camera. Now just the last thing really for this little section of camera matching, that has come in, and Maya puts this image plane at a default distance from the camera. So if I select my camera here, I can see that under my camera I will have an image plane shape, and that will have this little placement tab. It may have been put down there, and the default distance from the camera is 100 Maya units. So in my scene that is obviously 1 meter, that's the way I've got it set up. So if I change that depth there, if I change it to say 50, it will move closer to my camera, and you'll notice it gets scaled down. It gets scaled down so that it just about feels fills the field of view of my camera. So if I go back and look through my render cam, I see exactly the same thing, because it's been scaled down so it just fits inside the camera frustum there. So I want to in fact move it further away, because I want this image plane to be behind everything in my scene. So my baseline's back here, so I definitely want this further away from the camera than my baseline is from the camera. So I'm just going to pick a distance of 400 units, so 400 centimeters, and of course it scales up the image plane so it still just fits in the camera frustum. So I'm just going to save that there for now. Okay, so I'm just going to finish there for now. So we've partly done camera matching. We've got our camera in here. We can see we've got our camera height. It's not on the ground. We've brought in our image plane of our undistorted footage. We've created our baseline here. That's the right distance, and the locators either end. We've got the other triangulation bits, the other sides of the triangle to where the camera was, and we've got locators for those. They were all moved into the right position. We also got the camera tilt put in there. And of course right at the beginning we set up our focal length correctly for the camera, so that's in there, 35.5mm, and we put in our camera aperture, the sensor size that we actually were using to record with. And of course right at the beginning we'd actually set up our Maya grid, and we checked our Maya units were sensible for working in real world scale. Okay, so I'll finish there for now, but then I'll do another part 2 with how we'd actually take this and finish our camera matching. Okay, bye for now.